Palm Sunday is the only day in the liturgical calendar in which the gospel is read before Mass, followed by the Passion reading during Mass. Right, Gary?
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. Otherwise, I'd have to rewrite this really quick. Well, there's a stark contrast in mood between the gospel reading of the Lord's triumphant entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday and the solemn proclamation of the Passion. In the Palm Sunday gospel, Jesus is lauded as the Son of David in a triumphant entry into Jerusalem. And within 5 short days, he is mocked, scourged, spat upon, and killed by crucifixion. A horrible way to die. Have you ever wondered why we have these two seemingly contrasting stories read in the same liturgy? Why couldn't the church just let us enjoy the triumph of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem without having our joy dampened and tempered by the reading of the passion and death of Jesus? I mean, we don't read the Passion on Christmas when we're basking in the joy of the nativity of the Lord. So what's the deal here? What are we to make of these two extremes, the triumph of Palm Sunday and the seeming tragedy of the Passion? Now, it's really not that hard to reconcile because, as we know, the death of Jesus is not the final chapter. We have the joy of Easter resurrection that far surpasses the celebratory joy of Palm Sunday. The reconciliation of the gospel reading and the Passion reading occurs because something entirely new occurs. Something entirely new occurs. And I'd like to share a few thoughts with you about this something new occurring, because it's really the fabric of our lives and our existence. So bear with me while I say a few words about marriage and about basketball. Keep in the back of your mind this thought. Seeming opposites can be reconciled if we don't rigidly hang on to one thought versus a competing thought, a rigid notion of right versus a rigid notion of wrong, a rigid notion of good versus a rigid notion of evil. But when we move beyond dualistic thinking that requires it to be either this or that, no exceptions, to the possibility that something entirely new from two seemingly contradictory and mutually exclusive possibilities happens. The game of basketball has come a long way since it was invented 126 years ago. Some of you probably know this story. In 1891, James Naismith was a physical education teacher at Springfield College in Massachusetts. Now, popular outdoor sports like rugby, football, soccer couldn't be played in the harsh New England winters, and Naismith was asked to develop an indoor game that would be an athletic distraction for the rest of athletes. Now, in analyzing those sports, he seemingly borrowed a little bit from here and a little bit from there, and ultimately came up with something that was brand new, something no one could have imagined. Naismith nailed 2 peach baskets about 10 feet high up on the walls at both ends of the gym. Points were scored by throwing a soccer ball into the basket. Now, in the very first game, the players started tackling and slugging each other, resulting in several black eyes, a separated shoulder, and one player knocked unconscious. So Naismith had to tweak the rules to make physical contact a foul. You couldn't do it. It was a foul, and that resolved the problem. Now, within time, this winter distraction became the game we saw played today in last Monday night's championship NCAA game. Now, one could argue that a new sport had been invented. It wasn't either football, it wasn't soccer, it was something else. Now, we who are married know that on occasion, we don't see eye to eye and thus have conflicts that need to be resolved for the sake of the marriage. And we who are unmarried know that the same applies to our close friendships. In the resolution of marital conflicts, one can either accommodate or compromise. and both have their place. In accommodating, one partner decides that it's best if the other partner has his or her way in the matter. Let's go to the beach this year for vacation instead of the mountains. I can see how much you'd like to do that, and I want you to have it. Now, this is good if it's done in love and freedom, not in fear and obligation. This is good if it's done by both partners over time. It's not healthy if only one partner does it and the other doesn't. Compromise, accommodation and compromise are good. It's a good place to start in marriage, and it's a good thing to do throughout the course of the marriage. But there's something else, something new that occurs in marriage over time. The me that stands in strong contrast to the you becomes transformed into something brand new, the us. Now, some might argue that that's just a form of compromise. I suppose that could be true. But something else seems to happen in marriage over time. It's a strange and wonderful thing. Husbands and wives begin to experience themselves as an us, as in the biblical phrase, the two shall become one. It doesn't happen quickly, it can't be forced, and it's never completely accomplished, at least in this lifetime. But it happens. My wife Mary and I will be married 50 years this September, and it's amazing to us that we have begun to think alike, feel alike, and act alike in many respects. It's amazing to see how we somehow seem to know what the other is thinking or about to say before a word is spoken aloud. You knew what I was going to say, didn't you, Mary? Okay. Proves my point, okay? Also, she looks at my homilies for me, so she kind of cheats her. So she says, "You can't say that. I go, that's another story." Well, it is amazing to find that what is good for us becomes more important than what is good for me. One could argue that something brand new has been brought into existence. Now, the notion that I'm trying to share with you is to not get stuck in either-or thinking, because that's so limiting. Don't get stuck with seeking to stay desperately in one place, even if it seems like a good place, while desperately seeking to avoid, repress, or deny what seems to be those bad places in life. Something new is born when all of reality is embraced, both the so-called good and the so-called bad times of life. Where would we be in history if history had stopped on Palm Sunday? What would the world and humankind be like if we just stopped with the adulation of this itinerant preacher who was so wildly popular with the masses? How many such preachers have come and gone? Just a footnote in history. But we did not get stuck in the feel-good times of Palm Sunday. Jesus' popularity plummeted and his life ended on Good Friday. End of story. No, not quite. Because the end of this story was in reality the beginning, or in reality the continuation of something entirely new, something that has no end. And we'll hear a lot more about that next Sunday. But the point is, we don't have to have Palm Sunday or the Passion of Jesus. We have both. The church and all of us must embrace and celebrate both, because something utterly and remarkably new has emerged from the exhilaration of Palm Sunday and the anguish of Good Friday. We are freed from the false choice of either one or the other, and thus enter into the new transformation, into something entirely new. And our sacred scriptures shout it out. Isaiah 65, "For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth." Revelation 21, "And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth passed away." 2 Peter, "But in keeping with God's promise, we are looking forward to a new heaven and a new earth." 2 Corinthians, "So whoever is in Christ is a new creation. The old things have passed away, new things have come." in Ephesians 4. You should put away the old self of your former way of life and be renewed in the spirit of your minds and put on the new self, created in God's way of righteousness and holiness of truth. Now, every thinking person knows that life is a mixture of light and shadow, joy and sorrow, laughter and tears. In his letter to the Romans, St. Paul wrote, "And we know that all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose." Now, I think those words are a clarion call to not be limited to either or dualistic thinking, to enjoy the good times we have and the good things that come our way, to accept with a trusting heart the things that worry us or even harm us, to understand that somehow it all fits together, to believe that a loving God will not forever forsake his beloved sons and daughters, to realize that good beginnings sometimes seem to have bad ends, and bad beginnings sometimes seem to have good ends. Yet in both instances, God's goodness will prevail. Now, this is the pattern of life, and I think all we need to do to know that is to observe our own lives. And I think most of us would know then that that's true. This was the pattern for Jesus, and it is for us. In fact, Jesus is the pattern, and the Christ is the template. This is what we celebrate on this Palm Sunday and during this week that is holy. On March 20th, our daughter Bridget gave birth to a baby boy. His name is Marty McDougall. 2 days later, I paid a visit to a man I'd been seeing for a couple of months, and he was dying of pancreatic cancer. His name was Peter, and he was 62 years old. He died 2 days after I paid that visit to him. And all in a space of about 5 days, the same interval as between Palm Sunday and Good Friday, just about. I witnessed birth and I witnessed death. While one experience was pure joy and the other gentle sadness, there was something similar about these two events. I placed my hand on Marty's little bald head just hours after he came into this world, telling him how much I loved him. I placed my hand on Peter's equally bald head from age and from the cancer treatments, I suppose, just days before he left this world, telling him how much God loved him. And there was a sign of recognition that came, which was really fascinating because he was staring into nothingness, dying people sometimes do, but he heard that. I kissed little Marty on his little head when he was born. I almost kissed Peter when I was praying with him that last day of his life, almost. I didn't, I wish I had. But there was something about touching these two different heads that seemed about the same. It was life. It was life. It's God's most precious gift to all of us. It comes with its ups and downs, its joys and its sorrows. But it ends, or rather begins anew, with something brand new. And we call that life everlasting. All of it is to be celebrated and embraced.